The courthouse in Hollow Creek had no air conditioning that March morning, and the windows were swollen shut from the winter rains, and the room smelled of damp wool and pipe tobacco, and the particular sourness that gathers in a building where unhappy decisions are made. I stood at the back. I was 15 years old. I was wearing a dress that did not belong to me, borrowed from the wife of the Methodist minister, blue cotton, with white buttons running down the front, and the hem hung 2 inches below my knees because the minister's wife was a taller woman than I would ever be. I owned almost nothing in the world that day. I owned a tin cup, a wooden comb, a pair of work boots 1 size too large with newspaper folded inside the toes, a photograph of my mother taken before I was born, a pocket knife my father had given me on my 12th birthday, 2 months before a falling tree took him out of this world, without ceremony and without warning. That was the inventory of Hattie Whitmore, age 15, on the day Harlan Dray, attorney at law of Hollow Creek, West Virginia, opened a cracked leather folder on the courthouse table and began to read aloud the last will and testament of my grandfather, Ezra Whitmore. I did not look at the lawyer. I looked at the floor. The floorboards were oak dark, with 100 years of boots and tobacco juice, and one of them was loose near the front of the room, and I watched it lift slightly each time someone shifted their weight. Mr. Dray cleared his throat and read. He read the small things first: the cabin, the wood stove, the rifle, a pocket watch that had stopped working in 1932. He read these things in the careful, uninterested voice of a man who had read 1,000 wills and knew that none of them mattered very much in the long run. Then he came to the land. To my only grandchild, he read, Hattie Marie Whitmore, age 15, presently of no fixed residence. I leave the entirety of Lot 34, comprising 30 acres of ridgetop land east of Sutter's Gap, including all mineral and water rights therein. The room did not stay quiet. It did not stay quiet for so much as a breath. The laughter started somewhere in the middle of the courtroom, and it spread outward like a stone dropped in still water. And within seconds, the whole room was laughing full-throated and ugly and a little bit relieved, the way men laugh when they have been waiting a long time to see somebody fall. Mr. Crawford laughed loudest. Mr. Crawford ran the hardware store on Main Street, and he had once refused to extend my grandfather $2 of credit for fence wire. And he had told my grandfather to his face that a man who farmed rocks deserved to starve. He laughed now, with his head thrown back and his belly shaking under his vest. The Hadleys laughed. They had taken me in for 4 months in the autumn and turned me out the morning of this very hearing. And now they laughed, because the joke was on the orphan girl they had fed. And somehow that confirmed what they had always believed, which was that I had never been worth feeding in the first place. The widow Pike laughed. Mrs. Lattimore laughed, though hers was quieter, with a hand half raised to her mouth, the laugh of a woman who knew she should not be laughing, but could not entirely stop herself. The whole room laughed. The whole room except for one man. He sat in the front row. He wore a black wool coat too heavy for the season, and his hat rested on his knee, and his hands were folded over the brim of the hat, with a tightness I noticed even from the back of the room. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, gray at the temples, but still hard-faced, the kind of face that had been carved by weather and decision rather than years. His name was August Pruitt. He owned the Pruitt Lumber Company. He owned 6,000 acres of timber on the western slope of Sawback Mountain. He owned 3 sawmills and a railroad spur and a quarter share of the bank in Hollow Creek. He owned a great deal of the visible world in our county. And while every other man and woman in that courtroom laughed at the news that Ezra Whitmore had left his only grandchild 30 acres of stone, August Pruitt sat very still in the front row, and his jaw worked once, and his eyes did not leave the lawyer's face. I noticed this. I noticed it the way a hungry animal notices a thing that does not fit in the landscape. I did not yet understand what I was seeing, but I noticed. Mr. Dre finished reading. He closed the folder. He looked up at the room with the patient expression of a man who had heard laughter at Will's before and would hear it again. "That concludes the matter," he said. The judge struck his gavel. The room rose. The crowd moved toward the doors in a slow, unhurried tide, and as they passed me at the back, some of them looked at me, and some of them did not. And the ones who looked did not know how to arrange their faces, so they smiled in a way that was not a smile at all. I waited until the room emptied. I waited because I had nowhere to go, and there was no hurry to begin going there. When the last man stepped out into the gray March light, I walked forward to the table where Mr. Dre was gathering his papers. He looked up at me. He had kind eyes, I think, though I had not noticed it until that moment. He had been my grandfather's lawyer for 30 years. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes, sir." "You have a place to sleep tonight." It was not a question. It was the careful statement of a man who already knew the answer and was offering me the dignity of pretending otherwise. "I have my grandfather's cabin," I said. He nodded slowly. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope and pressed it into my hand. $42, he said. What was left in his account after my fee? He told me not to take a fee at all, but I took the smallest one I could in good conscience. "I'm sorry it isn't more." "It's more than I had this morning," I said. He almost smiled. He almost said something else. Then he simply nodded again and turned away, and I walked out of the courthouse into the cold March wind, an orphan with $42 in her pocket and 30 acres of stone in her name, and the laughter of a town still ringing in her ears like a struck bell. I want to tell you how I got there. I want to tell you because the story does not begin with the courtroom. The story begins 4 years earlier in a small house on the edge of Hollow Creek, where my mother lay coughing in a bed that smelled of camphor and lavender, and my father stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and could not look at her and could not look away. Pneumonia took her in February of 1937. I was 11. She was a quiet woman. She had been a teacher before she married my father, and she taught me to read before I was 4. and she read to me every night of my life until the last week when her voice was no longer something she owned. My father sat beside her bed for 3 nights without sleeping. On the 4th morning, he came out of the room and told me she was gone, and his face was a face I had never seen on him before. And it was the face he wore for the rest of his short life. He died 2 years later in the winter of 1939. He was working a logging crew on the eastern slope. A widowmaker, they call it. A dead branch hung up high in the canopy that breaks loose without warning when the tree below it is felled. It came down on him while he was bucking a trunk, and the men who carried him out said he was already gone before they reached the road. I was 13 years old. I had no brothers, no sisters. My mother's people were all dead or scattered, and my father's only living relative was his half-brother Lemuel, who lived in a tar paper shack on the far side of the county and drank whatever he could afford, and some things that cost him more than money. So I went to Lemuel first. I stayed 3 months. I do not want to talk about those 3 months. There are some things you do not put into words, not because the words are not there, but because saying them out loud gives them more power than they deserve. I left Lemuel's shack one morning before sunrise, and I walked 12 miles in the rain to the Lattimore farm, and Mrs. Lattimore took me in because she was a Christian woman, and because she needed a girl to mind her 3 younger children. I stayed 2 months at the Lattimores. I was useful to them. I did not have an opinion they wanted to hear, and when I said something one evening at supper about a book I had read, Mr. Lattimore set down his fork and told me that a girl in my position should learn to listen and not to speak. I left the next week. I went to the Widow Pike. Mrs. Pike was 73 years old and lived alone in a tilted house at the edge of the swamp. She found my habit of reading by candlelight disturbing and wasteful. She told me a girl who burned candles for books would burn her own house down by 25. I left after 6 weeks. I came last to the Hadleys. The Hadleys had a working farm and 4 children of their own, and a cot in a back room where the cold seeped up through the floorboards in winter. I stayed 4 months. I worked from before dawn until after dark. I milked the cows. I gathered the eggs. I scrubbed the floors. I minded the children. I did not complain because complaining had been beaten out of me long before the Hadleys. And I did not ask for anything because asking was the surest way to be reminded that I had nothing to ask with. On the morning of the will reading, Mrs. Hadley met me at the kitchen door before I left for the courthouse. "Hattie," she said, "don't bother coming back tonight. We've given your cot to my sister's boy. He's older. He's of more use." That was how she said it. Of more use. I took my bag and I walked to the courthouse. The bag held my tin cup and my wooden comb and my pocket knife, and the photograph of my mother and I carried it under my arm, like something I was ashamed to be seen with, which I suppose I was. And so I stood in the back of the courtroom in a borrowed dress and listened to the laughter of the town that had passed me from house to house like a stray dog. Nobody wanted to feed, but nobody was quite cold enough to drown. And when the laughter ended, I walked out of that courtroom and up the long road toward Sutter's Gap, and I climbed the path my grandfather had worn into the side of the ridge over 40 years of climbing it, and I came at last to the cabin where he had lived alone since my grandmother died in 1928, and I pushed open the door and I stepped inside the only place in the world that was now mine. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and old paper. It was a single room, perhaps 16 feet on a side, with a low ceiling of hand-hewn beams and a plank floor worn smooth by my grandfather's boots. There was a bed in one corner with a blue quilt pulled tight across it. There was a table with 2 chairs. There was the cast-iron wood stove he had salvaged from a schoolhouse demolition in 1923, still polished, still drawing well. There was a Bible on a shelf above the table. There was a Winchester rifle hanging on 2 pegs above the door. There were also books. I did not understand the books at first. I had been to the cabin perhaps 4 or 5 times in my life, always with my father, and I had been a small child then, and I had not paid attention to the shelves. Now I stood in the middle of the room and I looked around me, and I saw that almost every flat surface held books. There was a homemade shelf along the back wall, 10 feet long, 6 rows high, and it was full. There were stacks of books on the floor beside the bed. There were books wedged under the table books in a wooden crate by the stove. Books arranged on the windowsill where the late afternoon light was already beginning to fade. I set down my bag. I crossed to the shelf. I read the spines. The movement of water through porous rock. Subterranean streams of the Appalachian region. A field guide to springs, seeps, and aquifers of the Blue Ridge province. Carbonate geology of the Central Appalachians. The caves of Virginia and West Virginia. Karst topography and the hydrology of limestone terrains. There were 60 or 70 books on that shelf. Every one of them was a textbook of geology, hydrology, or cave science. I stood there in the gathering dark, with my hand on the spine of a book I did not understand the title of, and a cold, strange feeling moved through me that was not yet thought, that was something underneath thought, the way you sometimes feel a thing before your mind has put words on it. The town said my grandfather was a fool. The town said he had bought 30 acres of stone in 1919 for $12 and had spent the next 22 years failing to grow anything on it but mockery. The town said he was a stubborn old man who had wasted his life on a bad piece of land, and that the joke he had played on me with this inheritance was the final joke of a man who had never quite understood that the world was laughing at him. But the town did not know about these books. The town had never been inside this cabin. I lit the lamp on the table. I built a fire in the stove with kindling I found in the wood box. I sat down at the table and I opened the topmost book on the stack closest to me, and I began to read. I read until the lamp ran low. I read about how rainwater absorbs carbon dioxide from the soil and becomes mildly acidic and dissolves limestone over thousands of years. I read about how this dissolution creates fractures, and how fractures grow into channels, and how channels grow into caverns, and how caverns sometimes hold water in vast, hidden quantities beneath the surface of the world. I read about the Blue Ridge province. I read that beneath certain limestone ridges in our part of the country, there were aquifers, underground, reservoirs, bodies of water held in porous stone, the way a sponge holds water in its cells. I read until my eyes ached. I closed the book. I looked at the fire. I felt for the first time in 3 years a thing I had almost forgotten the name of. I felt curious. I slept that night in my grandfather's bed under the blue quilt my grandmother had stitched in 1925, and I dreamed of water moving through stone in absolute darkness. And I woke before sunrise to a cold cabin and a long, quiet day of being alive. The second day, I found the notebooks. I was sweeping the floor. I was using a broom with a handle worn smooth by my grandfather's hand, and the bristles caught on a floorboard near the foot of the bed, and I stopped. I bent down. I ran my fingers along the seam. The board was loose. I lifted it. In the cavity beneath the floor, packed in oiled cloth, was a tin box the size of a large Bible. I lifted the box out. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it to the table. I set it down. I sat in my grandfather's chair, and I worked the latch with my thumb, and I opened it. Inside the box were 14 notebooks. They were ordinary school composition books, the kind with marbled black and white covers, but they had been numbered in my grandfather's careful, angular hand. Number 1 was dated 1920. Number 14 was dated 1940. They covered 20 years. I lifted the first one out. The cover felt soft and worn. I opened it. The first page was a map. It was a hand-drawn topographical map of Lot 34, and the surrounding ridge executed with such precision and care that it took my breath out of my chest. Every contour line, every outcropping of stone, every depression and rise. There were small notations in the margins. Cold spot, standing moisture after rain, maidenhair fern colony, sinkhole possible collapse access point. I turned the page. The second page was a paragraph. It was dated April 11th, 1920. It read, "I have purchased this ridge for $12 from Garland Estate. The town considers me an idiot. Let them. There is water under this stone. I will spend the rest of my life proving it, and if I do not live to prove it, perhaps someone after me will." I sat very still for a long time. Outside the cabin, the wind moved through the leafless oaks on the slope below the ridge. A crow called once and then again. Somewhere far down in the valley, a dog was barking. The ordinary world continued on as it had always continued. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. My grandfather, who the town said was a fool who had been buried in January in a plain pine box with no one but the gravedigger and the minister at the service who had been mocked for 2 decades. for the worthless rocky ground he insisted on owning. My grandfather had not been a fool at all. He had been a scientist, a self-taught, careful, methodical 20-year scientist who had sat in this cabin every night by lamplight, reading every book he could get his hands on about water and stone, who had walked these 30 acres in every season and in every weather, who had measured and mapped and recorded and theorized, who had poured his life into a thing nobody else could see. I read the first notebook through that afternoon. I read the second the next day. By the end of the week, I had read all 14. He believed there was an aquifer beneath the ridge. Not a small one. A large one fed by the entire eastern face of Sawback Mountain, channeled through limestone fractures into a natural cavern beneath Lot 34, holding perhaps millions of gallons of clean, cold water, just 40 feet below the surface of the rock. He had been trying to find a way down to it. He had narrowed the search over 20 years to a particular sinkhole on the eastern edge of the ridge, which he called Sinkhole Number 7 in his careful numbering system. He believed the aquifer surface lay close enough to the bottom of that sinkhole to be reached by hand with patience, with effort. He had been close. The last notebook, the 14th, ended in November of 1940. The handwriting in those final pages was shakier than the early entries. The letters slightly larger, the pen pressed harder against the paper. He had been a sick man by then. The pneumonia that took him had been working in his chest for months. The very last entry, dated November 29th, 1940, said this: "My time is shorter than I had hoped. I will write what I know in case the work falls to another." And I closed the notebook and I set it on the table, and I understood with an absolute certainty that the work had fallen to another. It had fallen to me. April came. The snow on the high slopes of Sawback Mountain began to retreat. The $42 Mr. Dre had given me began to retreat as well, faster than I had expected, because I had to buy seeds and salt and lamp oil and a little flour, and a girl living alone on a ridge spends money on things she would not have thought of in another life. By the middle of April, I was hungry. It was a particular kind of hunger. It was not the sharp hunger of a missed meal. It was the slow, steady hunger of a body that is not getting enough to keep itself going, and it changes you. Your eyes get sharper. Your hearing gets sharper. You start to notice things you would not have noticed before, like the way the wood sorrel grows along the north face of certain rocks, or the way the wild ramps push up through the leaf litter in the shaded hollows where the snow lingered longest. I planted a garden. I planted it in the thin strip of clay soil that ran along the base of the ridge near the cabin. The strip was perhaps 30 feet wide and 100 feet long. The soil was poor. It was too poor for serious farming, which is why my grandfather had never tried to make a living from it. But it was soil, and it would grow things if I worked it. I hauled leaf litter from the forest floor in burlap sacks and turned it into the clay. I carried buckets of water from a small seep a quarter mile down the slope, 2 buckets at a time, 4 trips a day. I composted every scrap of vegetable matter. I had every potato peel and apple core and wilted green. I built a low stone wall along the lower edge of the strip to keep the soil from washing down the slope in heavy rains. I went into Hollow Creek once that month. I went to Mr. Crawford's hardware store because there was nowhere else to buy seeds. Mr. Crawford was behind the counter. He looked at me when the bell over the door rang, and his face did the thing faces sometimes do when they cannot quite arrange themselves into the expression their owner intends. He had laughed at me in the courtroom 3 weeks before. He could not quite look at me now without remembering it. "Miss Whitmore," he said.
"Mr. Crawford, what can I do for you?" I told him I needed seeds. I told him what kinds. He went to the wall of small wooden bins along the back of the store, and he scooped seeds into paper packets, and he weighed them on his brass scale, and he wrote the weights on the packets with a stub of pencil. He did not look at me while he did it. When he was done, he laid the packets on the counter. $1.50, he said. I counted out the coins from a small leather pouch I had found in my grandfather's things. I laid them on the counter. He swept them into the till. I gathered the packets and turned for the door, and as my hand was on the latch, he spoke. "You planning to farm, rock girl?" I turned back. He was looking at me now. His mouth had a small curl at one corner that I do not think he was aware of. "I'm planning to eat Mr. Crawford." I went out. The bell rang behind me. I walked the 4 miles back to the ridge with the seeds in my coat pocket and the words "planning to eat" repeating in my head, and I planted those seeds the next morning, and I told myself that I would eat, and that the people who had laughed in that courtroom would one day wish they had not. Though I did not yet know how, and it would be many years before I understood that the answer was not the answer I expected. In the evenings, I read. I read my grandfather's books, and I read his notebooks. I taught myself the vocabulary of stone, limestone, dolomite, karst, conduit, resurgence, phreatic zone, vadose zone, aquifer. The words felt strange in my mouth at first, like words from a foreign language, and then less strange, and then mine. I walked the ridge with his notebooks in my hand, and I matched his observations to what I could see. The cold spot near the eastern outcrop, where the air came up out of the stone on hot mornings, smelling of wet rock. The maidenhair fern colony in the depression he had labeled Sinkhole Number 7. The patches of moss that stayed green even in late summer when the rest of the ridge was brown. The line of taller, deeper-rooted oaks along a particular contour, marking the path of an underground fracture. It was all there. Every observation he had made, I could verify with my own eyes. Every sign was real. By the middle of May, I believed. I do not mean I hoped. Hope is a small thing, a flickering thing. I mean, I believed the way a person believes the sun will rise.
I knew there was water under the rock. I had not yet seen it, but I knew. And the knowing changed how I walked the ridge. It was no longer 30 acres of worthless stone the town had laughed at me for inheriting. It was a vault, and somewhere on its surface was the seam I would find and open. I was working in the garden on a warm afternoon in the middle of May when I heard the horse. I straightened. I shaded my eyes with one hand. A man on a tall bay horse was coming up the path from the valley road. He was dressed in a black wool coat too heavy for the day, and his hat was pulled low, and he sat the horse with the easy authority of a man who had ridden a great many horses across a great many properties he believed he could buy if he wished to. I knew him before he was close. August Pruitt. He stopped the horse at the edge of my garden. He did not dismount. He looked down at me from a height that I think he believed gave him an advantage, and he removed his hat with one slow gesture, as if granting me a courtesy. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Pruitt. You've been working hard. I can see that. I did not answer. There was nothing to answer. He had not asked me a question. He looked past me at the cabin. He looked at the garden. He looked at the ridge rising behind it gray and stark under the May sun. He looked at all of it slowly and carefully. And I had the strange feeling that he was not seeing what I was seeing, that he was looking at the same ground and seeing something else underneath it. I knew your grandfather, he said. I know. He and I had business once or twice. We did not see eye to eye on every matter. But I respected him. I want you to know that. All right. He turned his hat slowly in his hands. The horse shifted under him. A fly landed on the horse's neck, and he flicked it away with the ends of the reins. I'll come to it plain, Miss Whitmore. I'd like to buy this ridge from you. I had expected something. I had not expected that. Why? I said. Why this ridge? His mouth made a small movement that was not quite a smile. I've been buying up land in this part of the county for 30 years. Timberland. Some of it borders yours. There's value in continuity. A man who owns 5,000 contiguous acres has more leverage with the railroad than a man who owns 4,000 and a hole in the middle. That's the long and short of it. 30 acres of bad rock. 30 acres. How much? $250. I did not move. I did not let my face change. But inside my chest, something cold and bright shifted into place. Because $250 was 20 times what my grandfather had paid for this land in 1919, and 20 times what the town said it was worth. And August Pruitt was not a man who paid 20 times for anything. That's generous, Mr. Pruitt. It's fair. It's more than fair. It's more than the land is worth by every account I've heard in this town. He said nothing. My grandfather paid $12 for it. I know what he paid. And you're offering me $250. I am. I bent down.
I picked up the hoe I had been working with. I leaned on it. I looked up at him on his tall bay horse in his heavy black coat under the May sun. "No, sir," I said. "I'll keep it." He was very still for a moment. Then he nodded slowly as if he had expected the answer and was only confirming it for himself.
"Your grandfather said the same thing."
"What?"
"Your grandfather. I made him an offer once. He said the same thing you just said. Word for word almost. I'll keep it." "When was this?"
He smiled, then a thin, tired smile, and he set his hat back on his head, and he turned the bay horse with a small movement of his reins.
"I made him 3 offers, Miss Whitmore, over the years. He turned down every one. The last was not so very long ago."
"How long ago?"
"You think on my offer,"
he said, ignoring the question.
$250 is a great deal of money for a 15-year-old girl with no people. You'll have time to start a real life somewhere. Town, school, a future. Think on it."
He touched the brim of his hat. He turned the horse down the path. I watched him go. I watched him until he disappeared around the curve of the slope, and the sound of the hooves faded into the afternoon. And I stood there, leaning on the hoe in my grandfather's garden. And I felt my heart beating in my throat in a way it had not beat in a long time. $250. A man does not offer 20 times the value of a worthless piece of rock unless he believes the rock is not worthless. I went into the cabin. I went to the table. I opened the tin box and I took out notebook number 12, dated 1937 and 1938. And I sat down and I began to read it again, more slowly this time, with different eyes. I found it on the 7th page. It was an entry dated June 14th, 1938. The handwriting was tight and small, the way my grandfather's handwriting got when he was writing something he did not want to put on paper, but felt he must. Pruitt came again today, the 3rd time this year. He wants the ridge. He has tripled his last offer. He does not know that I know what he knows, but I know it now. He has been watching the eastern face. He has seen what I have seen. He is a careful man and a patient one, and he believes he has time to wear me down. He may. I am 64 years old, and my chest is not what it was. But I will not sell. If I die before I find it, the work falls to whoever I leave the ground to. God help that person, because Pruitt will come for them next, and they must be ready. I set the notebook down. I sat at the table for a long time. The afternoon sun moved across the floor, and I did not light the lamp when it grew dim. I sat in the gathering dark, and I understood at last what my grandfather had left me. He had not left me 30 acres of rock. He had not left me a joke. He had left me a race he had not finished. A race against a careful, patient man who had watched my grandfather for 20 years and had now turned his eyes on me, on a 15-year-old orphan girl, alone in a cabin on a ridge, who could be bought or worn down or pushed aside, and whose grandfather had laid down only one weapon for her to fight with. 14 notebooks, a map, a theory, 20 years of evidence, and the time he had bought me by refusing to sell. I lit the lamp. I built up the fire. I cooked a small meal of cornmeal mush, and I ate it slowly at the table. And when I was done, I cleaned the bowl and I put it away, and I returned to the table, and I opened notebook number 1 again. I read until the small hours of the morning. I read about water and stone, about pressure and porosity, about the slow, secret movement of liquids through the bones of the earth. I read by the yellow light of a lamp my grandfather had filled 1,000 times in a chair he had sat in for 20 winters in a cabin on a ridge that the town had laughed at him for owning. And as I read, I began to plan. I did not yet know how I would do it. I did not know where I would find the strength or the tools or the help or the time. I only knew that I would do it. I would find his water. I would find it before August Pruitt's patience ran out, before the town could pity me out of my own land, before another winter could break the cabin or my body. I would find it because my grandfather had run out of time and I had not, and because the only thing in this world that was now mine was the chance to finish the work he had begun. Outside the cabin, the wind moved across the ridge, across the 30 acres of stone, the whole valley called Worthless, and somewhere 40 feet below my feet, in absolute darkness, in patience that had measured time in centuries, the water waited. It had been waiting a long time. It would wait a little longer, but not, I thought, much longer than that. The summer of 1941 came on hot and dry. I had read in one of my grandfather's books that the Appalachian summer can be deceptive, that the wet green of June gives way without warning to the cracked brown of August, and that a man who plans his year by the rain has not lived long enough on the ridges. I had not understood the passage when I first read it. I understood it by the second week of June, when I went down to the seep that fed my buckets and found it running at half its April rate. And I understood it more deeply by the second week of July, when I went down and found it not running at all. The seep had been my water for 3 months. It was a small thing, a dampness in a hollow at the base of a mossy rock, and I had built a little stone basin under it to catch the slow drip, and I had carried 2 buckets up the slope to the cabin, 3 or 4 times a day, every day. The trip was a 1/4 mile down and a 1/4 mile up, and the up was steep, and by the end of June, my legs had become the legs of a different girl, hard at the calves, hard at the thighs, no softness anywhere. When the seep failed, I walked the ridge for 2 days looking for another. I found nothing. I found dry channels in the stone where water had clearly run in some other year. I found the cracked beds of small pools long evaporated. I found the bleached white shells of crayfish that had not lived to see this drought. I found the brown leaves of plants that had been green a month before and were now curling up to die. What I did not find was water. There was water in Hollow Creek, of course. The town well still ran. The deep wells of the bottomland farms still drew. But Hollow Creek was 4 miles away by the road, and the bottomland farms were farther than that. And I had no horse and no cart and no neighbor who would have lent me either. I had a barrel. I had found it in the woodshed in April, an old oak barrel with 2 iron hoops and 1 stave that had begun to spring. I had soaked it in the creek for a week to swell the wood back tight, and I had set it under the eave of the cabin to catch what rain came off the roof. In June, it had filled twice. By the middle of July, it had not filled at all, and the bottom of it held perhaps 3 inches of warm green water that I would not have given to a sick dog. I want to be honest about that summer. The story people tell later always skips the ugly parts, the desperate parts, the parts where you lie awake at 3 in the morning, listening to your own breathing, and wondering whether you will see September and what September will look like if you do. I was hungry that summer. The garden was producing, but it was producing slowly, and a tomato that ripens in August will not feed you in July. I ate wild ramps and wood sorrel and chickweed. I ate the small green crab apples from a tree behind the cabin, sour enough to make my eyes water. I trapped a rabbit in a snare I learned to make from a chapter in one of my grandfather's books. I learned to clean it with my pocket knife, and the first time I did it, I cried, not because it had been alive and now was not, but because I was so hungry that the smell of the meat over the fire made my hands shake. I lost weight. The minister's wife's blue dress, which had hung 2 inches below my knees in March, hung 2 inches farther by July. I cinched it with a leather strap I had cut from an old harness in the shed. But I did not go down to Hollow Creek to ask for help. I want to be clear about why. It was not pride. Pride is a thing you can afford when you have other things. I had nothing else. What I had instead was a kind of cold, steady knowing that the moment I went down that road and asked the answer would be the same answer I had been given for 3 years. They would take me in. They would feed me. They would put me in a room with a cot and 4 walls. And when I had recovered enough to be useful again, the cot would belong to somebody else's nephew, and I would walk out of that house with my bag under my arm, and I would have lost the only thing my grandfather had given me, which was the time to find his water. So I stayed. I read every evening by lamplight. I read the books I had read already and the books I had not read yet. I memorized passages on the structure of limestone and the behavior of underground streams.
I memorized the names of the dissolution features that shape karst landscapes. Sinkhole, Dolin, Uvala, Polye, disappearing stream, resurgence. The words were a music I sang to myself while I carried buckets of brown water from the cabin barrel up the slope to keep the garden alive. And I walked the ridge. I walked it every morning before the heat. I walked it with notebook number 12 open in my hand. I walked it the way my grandfather had walked it for 20 years, and I learned what he had learned slowly with the slowness of a thing that cannot be rushed. He had marked 7 sinkholes on the surface of Lot 34. He had numbered them in the order he had identified them. Sinkhole number 1 was at the western edge, a shallow depression he had ruled out as too far from the suspected aquifer line. Sinkholes 2 through 5 were strung along the ridge spine. Number 6 was on the southern flank. Number 7 was on the eastern face. His notebooks were clear that number 7 was the one. He had spent the last 10 years of his life working in and around it. He had measured its temperature gradient. He had cataloged the plants that grew at its bottom. He had observed the way fog gathered in it on summer mornings when the rest of the ridge was clear. Every sign told him that the aquifer surface beneath number 7 was closer to the bottom of that depression than anywhere else on the property. I went to sinkhole number 7 on the morning of July 14th, 1941. I had been to it before, of course. I had been to it a dozen times since April. But I had been to it as a student of my grandfather's notes, walking the perimeter, taking measurements, trying to understand the ground. I had not been to it as a worker. That morning, I went with a shovel and a pickaxe and a lantern and a length of rope, and I went down into it. The depression was about 12 feet across at the rim and perhaps 15 feet deep at its lowest point. The walls were not vertical. They sloped at maybe 60 degrees, and I could climb them without the rope if I was careful. The bottom was a tangled mess of fallen stone, rotted logs, leaf litter from 40 autumns, and the dense black earth that gathers in any low place over time. I started clearing it. I started at the lowest point, and I worked outward. I lifted stones with my hands when I could. I levered stones with the pickaxe handle when I could not. I hauled the smaller debris up and out in a feed sack tied to the end of the rope, dragging it over the rim and dumping it on the slope behind me, sack after sack after sack. The leaf litter alone filled the sack 30 times. The work took 3 days. By the end of the 3rd day, I had reached the bedrock at the bottom of the sinkhole, and my palms were raw and weeping, and my back had locked into a position it would hold for a week. And there was a thin, cold wind rising from a fissure in the stone at my feet. I stood very still. The fissure was perhaps 2 feet across at its widest point. It ran roughly north to south. It looked like a place where the bedrock had cracked open during some ancient settling, and the crack had been packed for centuries with the slow accumulation of detritus from the surface. And now I had cleared it. I knelt down. I held my hand over the fissure. Cold air, not a draft. A breath. A slow, steady rise of air
that was perhaps 15 degrees colder than the July morning around me, and damp, and smelling of wet stone, and smelling of something else, something old, something that did not belong to the world above. I picked up a small pebble. I held it over the fissure. I let it fall. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3. And then faintly, from somewhere far below me in the dark, I heard a small, soft sound that might have been a stone striking another stone, or might have been a stone striking water. I dropped a second pebble. I listened harder this time. I closed my eyes. The sound came again. 3 seconds. And this time I was sure of it. It was not stone striking stone. It was a sound like a child throwing a small thing into a bucket of milk, soft and round and final. And I had heard the sound 1,000 times in my life, and there was no mistaking what made it. I sat down at the bottom of sinkhole number 7. I sat there for a long time. The sun moved a little. A small green lizard came out from a crack in the wall and looked at me and went back inside. A jay called somewhere in the oaks above the rim. The world continued, and I cried. I cried the way a person cries when something they have wanted for a long time is suddenly real, when a thing they have been carrying alone is suddenly carried for them, when the proof they have needed has arrived without warning and is sitting in their lap. He had been right. My grandfather had been right. For 22 years he had walked this ridge, and they had laughed at him, and he had been right the whole time, and the water was here 3 seconds beneath my boots, in absolute darkness, exactly where he had said it would be. I climbed out of the sinkhole as the sun was beginning to set. I walked back to the cabin in a kind of trance. I lit the lamp. I sat at the table. I wrote in the back of notebook number 14 in my own hand, in the first blank pages my grandfather had left, 3 sentences. Number 7 confirmed. Water at approximately 40 feet. The work continues. I closed the notebook. I put my head down on my arms on the table, and I slept where I sat until the lamp burned itself out. The man came on the 3rd morning after. I was in the garden. I was bent over the bean rows, pulling small weeds. I heard the wagon before I saw it, a creaking and the slow clop of a single horse, and I straightened up and shaded my eyes with my hand, and I watched the wagon come up the path from the valley road. It was not August Pruitt. It was a young man in a dark suit and a city hat, and he sat on the buckboard with the rigid posture of a man who had never sat on a buckboard before this morning. And beside him sat a second man, an older one, holding a leather case in his lap. They stopped at the edge of the garden. The young man climbed down stiffly. He removed his hat. He approached me with the kind of careful courtesy a man uses when he has been instructed to be polite.
Miss Whitmore?
Yeah,
My name is Edmund Slater. I am an attorney representing Mr. August Pruitt of Hollow Creek. This gentleman is Mr. Royce Vannerman, a clerk of the Hawksbill County Court. We have come to deliver a document. He held out an envelope. I did not take it. What kind of document? I said. A petition has been filed in the court of Hawksbill County concerning the guardianship of the property known as Lot 34. You are named as the respondent. You are required to appear before Judge Hiram Bell on the morning of the 22nd of August at 10 o'clock in the courthouse in Hollow Creek.
I took the envelope. I held it. The paper was heavy. The seal of the county was pressed into red wax on the back.
What does the petition say? The petition is enclosed. I would like you to tell me, Mr. Slater, in your own words, while you are standing in my garden. He glanced at the older man. The older man looked at the ground. The young attorney returned his eyes to me. He was perhaps 25 years old. His coat was new. He had been in this part of the country for less than a week, I guessed, and he was earning his fee, and he did not enjoy what he had been sent to do. The petition argues, he said slowly, that you are a minor of 15 years with no living parents and no court-appointed guardian in possession of a property that contains, in the petitioner's opinion, hazards to your physical safety and to the public welfare. The petition requests that the court appoint a guardian of the property to manage Lot 34 until you reach the age of majority. Mr. Pruitt has offered his services as guardian and is prepared to compensate you fairly for the use of the land during the guardianship period. I felt the cold thing move in my chest again. Compensate me fairly, I said. Yes, ma'am. $250 perhaps. He blinked. I am not at liberty to discuss the specific terms. Mr. Slater? Ma'am, I am 15 years old. I am alone on this ridge. I have no money for a lawyer. Mr. Pruitt knows this. He is not asking the court for a guardian because he is worried about my safety. He is asking because he wants this land, and he could not buy it from my grandfather, and he cannot buy it from me, and he has now found a way to take it that does not require either of us to agree. The young attorney looked at me for a long moment. He was a decent man, I think. He had a decent man's face. He had taken a job from a powerful client, and he had not understood what the job was when he took it. And now he was understanding it, and he did not like himself very much in that moment. Miss Whitmore, he said, I am required to deliver the document. I have delivered it. I will say no more than that. Good day to you. He climbed back onto the buckboard. The older clerk had not spoken a single word the entire time. The young attorney clucked at the horse, and the wagon turned and rolled back down the path, and I stood in the garden with the envelope in my hand and the morning sun on my face, and I did not move for a long time. Then I went inside the cabin. I sat at the table. I opened the envelope. I read the petition. It was 4 pages of dense legal English,
and I had to read it twice to understand it fully. But I understood it the second time. August. Pruitt was asking the court to declare me incompetent to manage my own property. He was asking the court to appoint him as the guardian. He was offering in exchange to pay me a small annual stipend and to assume responsibility for the maintenance of Lot 34 until my 18th birthday. If the court granted the petition, he would have legal control of the ridge for 3 years. 3 years was more than enough time to do anything he wanted with it. I closed the petition. I sat at the table for a while. Then I rose and I went to the tin box and I took out all 14 notebooks. I stacked them on the table in order. I sat back down. I opened number 1 to the first page. I began to read. I read for the next 4 weeks. I did not stop walking the ridge. I did not stop weeding the garden. I did not stop carrying buckets of brown rainwater from the barrel to the bean rows in the dry afternoon heat. But every spare hour I had, I read. I read my grandfather's notebooks the way a lawyer reads case files. I copied out the relevant passages onto sheets of paper I had bought in Hollow Creek for 2 cents a sheet. I organized them by topic: the map, the geological theory, the 20-year record of observations, the names of the books and articles he had drawn his understanding from. I built a defense. I built it the only way I knew how, which was carefully, slowly, with the patience of a girl who had nothing else to spend. The morning of August 22nd was clear and warm. I walked the 4 miles down to Hollow Creek alone. I wore the minister's wife's blue dress, which I had washed twice that week, and pressed with a flat iron heated on the wood stove. I carried the 14 notebooks in a canvas bag at my side. The notebooks weighed perhaps 15 pounds. The bag had been my grandfather's. It still smelled faintly of him, of pipe tobacco and oiled leather, and the cold, clean smell of the cabin. I did not have a lawyer. I walked into the courthouse at 5 minutes before 10. The same courthouse where I had stood at the back 5 months earlier in this same dress and listened to a room full of people laugh. The room was less full this morning. There were perhaps 15 people scattered through the benches. August Pruitt was at the front in a chair at the petitioner's table, with the young attorney Edmund Slater at his side. Pruitt did not turn around when I entered. He did not need to. I walked up the aisle. I sat down at the respondent's table. I set the canvas bag on the table beside me. I waited. Judge Hiram Bell came in at 10 exactly. He was a thin man in his late 60s with white hair and a dark robe that hung loosely on his shoulders. He had been the circuit judge of Hawksbill County for 30 years. He had known my grandfather. He had been the only man from town who had visited the cabin on my grandfather's 70th birthday in 1939, bringing a bottle of bourbon and a chess set, and the two of them had played until midnight on the porch, while my grandfather laughed at his own bad moves. Judge Bell sat down. He looked out over the courtroom. His eyes paused on me for perhaps half a second longer than they paused on anyone else. "This court is in session," he said. The young attorney rose. He laid out the petition. He spoke for 15 minutes. He spoke well, I thought. He used words like prudence and welfare and reasonable oversight. He did not look at me while he spoke. When he was finished, the judge turned to me. "Miss Whitmore, do you have counsel?" "No, sir." "Are you prepared to respond to the petition?" "Yes, sir." "Then please proceed." I rose. My hands were shaking. I gripped the edge of the table to steady them. I looked at Judge Bell, and I looked at no one else, and I began to speak. "Your Honor, the petition says I cannot manage this land. The petition says it contains hazards. The petition says I am too young and too alone and too ignorant to understand what I have inherited. I would like to show the court what I have inherited." I lifted the canvas bag onto the table. I opened it. I took out the 14 notebooks one at a time, and I laid them in a row. My grandfather, Ezra Whitmore, kept these notebooks for 20 years. He kept them in a tin box under the floor of the cabin at the base of Lot 34. They contained his observations, his measurements, his theories, and his findings concerning the geology and hydrology of that ridge. He believed there was a substantial freshwater aquifer beneath the property. He spent 2 decades attempting to prove it. He was a self-taught man. He had no university training. He never published a paper. The town of Hollow Creek considered him a fool. I paused. "He was not a fool, Your Honor." I lifted the first notebook. I opened it to the map. This is a hand-drawn topographical map of the property executed in 1920. It is, to my knowledge, the most detailed map of that ridge in existence. He drew it without instruments other than a level and a measuring chain. I have walked the ridge with this map in my hand. Every contour is correct. I lifted the second notebook. I opened it to a page in the middle. This is a record of temperature measurements taken at the bottom of 7 sinkholes on the property over a period of 14 years. The measurements were taken at the same time of day, in the same season, with the same thermometer. They show that one of those sinkholes, which my grandfather designated number 7, has a consistent temperature gradient suggesting proximity to a body of cold water. I lifted the 12th notebook. I opened it to the last page he had written. This is the entry he made in November of 1943, months before his death. It says, "My time is shorter than I had hoped. I will write what I know in case the work falls to another." I closed the notebook. I looked at Judge Bell. "The work has fallen to me, Your Honor. I am 15 years old and I have no people. I do not have a lawyer because I cannot afford one. I do not have a guardian because no one in this county has wanted me long enough to be one. I have a garden and a cabin and these notebooks and 30 acres of stone that everyone in this town, except for the man at that table, believes is worthless." I gestured toward August Pruitt without looking at him. "Mr. Pruitt is a careful man. He has offered to buy the ridge from me twice. The second offer was 20 times the price my grandfather paid for it in 1919.
A man who is willing to pay 20 times the going rate for a piece of worthless rock either is not a careful man, which Mr. Pruitt clearly is, or does not believe the rock is worthless. The petition before you suggests that I am incapable of understanding my own property. Your Honor, I would suggest that I am the only person other than my grandfather who has ever understood it at all. I sat down. The room was quiet. The young attorney did not look at me. August Pruitt did not look at me. The dust moved in the column of light coming through the high window behind the judge. Judge Bell sat for a long moment. He looked down at the notebooks I had laid out on the respondent's table. He looked at me. He looked at August Pruitt. He cleared his throat. The petition is denied. There was a small movement in the courtroom, a breath taken and held. However, the judge continued, I will note for the record that the respondent is 15 years old and is residing alone on a remote property. The court has a continuing interest in the welfare of minors in this county. I am therefore setting a review of this matter for 12 months from today. Miss Whitmore, you will appear before this court on the 22nd of August, 1942, and you will demonstrate to the satisfaction of this court that you are capable of managing the property safely and productively. If you cannot do so, the court will revisit the petition at that time. Do you understand? Yes, sir. 12 months, Miss Whitmore. Use them well. I will, Your Honor. He struck the gavel. The court rose. I gathered the notebooks back into the canvas bag. I did not look at August Pruitt as I walked out of the courtroom, but I felt his eyes on me, and they were not the eyes of a man who had been defeated. They were the eyes of a man who had been delayed. I walked the 4 miles back to the ridge. I walked them slowly. I was tired in a way that went deeper than legs. I reached the cabin in the late afternoon, and I set the canvas bag on the table, and I sat down in my grandfather's chair, and I did not move for a long time. 12 months. It was less time than I needed, and more time than I had. The old man came on the morning of September 15th. I was at the bottom of sinkhole number 7 again. I had spent the 3 weeks since the hearing trying to widen the fissure I had cleared. I had done it the only way I could think of, with the pickaxe and a chisel and a small sledgehammer I had found in the woodshed. The work was slow. The bedrock was hard. I was not strong enough to swing the sledgehammer with any real force, and the chisel kept skipping off the stone and slicing my hands. I was bleeding from a fresh cut on my left thumb when I heard a voice above me. You'll ruin your hands like that, child. I looked up. He stood at the rim of the sinkhole. He was an old man, perhaps 70, in a gray work shirt and brown trousers held up by suspenders. He was thin and stooped, leaning on a walking stick. His face was the color and texture of old leather, and his eyes were pale gray, like water under thin ice. My name is Tobias Mercer, he said. I knew your grandfather. We played chess on his porch on Sunday afternoons. I have not been up this ridge in 3 years. I came up today because I heard you were working a sinkhole, and I thought to myself that it would be the one Ezra was always going on about, and that you would be doing it wrong, because nobody ever taught you how to read stone. I did not know what to say. He worked his way slowly down the sloping wall of the sinkhole, leaning on the walking stick, his old knees making small sounds of protest at each step. He reached the bottom. He stood across from me. He looked at the fissure. He looked at the chisel marks I had made on the stone, scattered and shallow and going nowhere. "Hand me the chisel," he said. I handed it to him. He turned it over in his hand. He felt the edge with his thumb. He nodded. "Steel is good, edge is dull. You've been hitting square stone with a chisel that wants resharpening every 2 hours. That's why it's skipping." He handed it back to me. "My back is gone, child. 20 years of laying limestone walls did for it. I cannot lift what I once lifted. I cannot swing a sledge anymore at all. But my arms still work, and my eyes still see stone, and I can teach a girl who is willing to learn how to break a rock without breaking herself." He set down the walking stick. He took off his work coat. He folded it carefully and laid it on a flat ledge of the sinkhole wall. He picked up the small sledgehammer. He held it out to me. "Show me how you've been swinging this." I took the sledge. I positioned myself at the fissure. I swung the way I had been swinging for 3 weeks with all my strength with my arms and my back, and the sledge struck the chisel, and the chisel skipped sideways, and the sledge head buried itself in the soft earth at the base of the wall. Tobias Mercer made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That is the swing of a girl who has read about hammers in a book," he said. "Set the chisel like this, hold it like this. Do not swing with your shoulders. Swing with your knees and let the weight of the head do the work. The sledge knows what to do. Your job is to put it where it needs to go." He showed me. He took the chisel and the sledge in his old hands. He set them. He swung. The motion was small and economical and ugly, and the chisel bit into the bedrock with a sound entirely different from any sound my swinging had made. A clean, ringing sound, and a chip of limestone the size of my thumb came away from the fissure edge. He handed the tools back to me. "Now you," he said. I tried. I got it wrong. I tried again. I got it wrong again. He did not tell me I was a fool. He did not sigh. He simply watched, and when I was almost right, he said almost, and when I was not almost right, he said again. And after the 7th swing, I felt something shift in my body, and the chisel bit into the stone, and a chip came away. He nodded once. "That is how you break a rock without breaking yourself." He picked up his walking stick. He started the slow climb up the sloping wall. At the rim, he stopped and turned back. "I will come tomorrow," he said, "if you want me." "I want you, Mr. Mercer." "Tobias is fine. Mr. Mercer was my father."
He went. I stood at the bottom of sinkhole number 7 with the chisel in one hand and the sledge in the other, and I looked at the small, clean chip of limestone he had taken off the fissure edge, and I looked at the hopeless mess of shallow scratches I had made over 3 weeks of trying alone. I did not cry. I was past crying, but I felt for the first time since the petition had been delivered that I might not lose. The work continued through the autumn. Tobias came every day. He never stayed for more than 3 hours. He could not. His back would seize up after 2, and the 3rd hour was paid for in pain that lasted into the night. But he came. He came, and he taught me. He taught me how to read a piece of limestone before I struck it, how to find the natural fracture lines that had been laid down when the stone was formed, how to drive a wedge instead of a chisel into a long crack and split a slab in half with one careful blow. He taught me how to use the timber pole my grandfather had left in the woodshed as a lever, and how to roll boulders downhill with 2 ropes, and patience, and how to know when a rock was about to shift in a way that could kill you. He was not a talker. He spoke perhaps 50 words in an average day, but the words he spoke were the right words, and I learned more from him in 6 weeks than I had learned from my grandfather's books in 6 months. The fissure grew wider. We followed it down. By the middle of October, we had cleared a working face 6 feet deep into the side of the sinkhole, and the cold breath rising from the deeper crack at the bottom was stronger than ever. It was on the afternoon of November 25th, 2 days before Thanksgiving, that I broke through. I was alone. Tobias had left an hour earlier, his back locked up early in the cold. I was working at the deepest point of our excavation. The day had a thin gray sky and the smell of coming snow. I had been swinging for perhaps 40 minutes, the steady ringing rhythm Tobias had taught me, and I was tired in the way that lets a body work past its own thinking. The pickaxe came down. The point struck the stone. The stone was not there. The pickaxe punched through into nothing, into open air, into a cold, black emptiness on the other side of the wall I had been chipping at for 2 months, and the sudden absence of resistance threw me forward off my feet, and I caught myself on my hands and knees in the rubble at the bottom of the cut. Cold air rushed into my face. It was not a draft. It was a wind, an exhalation from the throat of the earth, damp and freezing and smelling of wet stone and antiquity, and it kept coming, and it did not stop, and I knelt there in the rubble, and I felt it move my hair against my forehead. I pulled the pickaxe out of the hole. I held the lantern up to the opening I had made. The hole was perhaps the size of my fist. Beyond it, the lantern light dissolved into absolute darkness. I could see nothing. I could only feel the cold air and smell the smell. I put my ear to the hole. I closed my eyes. I listened. For a long moment, I heard only my own pulse in my ear, the heavy rushed sound of a heart working harder than it should. I made myself breathe. I made my body still. I listened past my own blood. And then I heard it. A sound, soft and constant, very far below the patient, unhurried sound of moving water in a place where water had been moving for 10,000 years and was in no hurry to stop. I sat back on my heels. The lantern flame trembled in the rising air. The cold breath of the cavern moved across my face. The world above the rim of the sinkhole had gone very quiet, the way the world goes quiet just before a snow. I did not say anything. There was no one to say anything to. But somewhere 20 miles away, in a small house at the edge of Hollow Creek, an old man with a bad back was sitting at his kitchen table eating his supper. And tomorrow morning, he would walk slowly up the path to the ridge. And I would meet him at the rim of sinkhole number 7, and I would take him by the hand, and I would lead him down to the cut. And I would put his old face close to a hole the size of my fist in the limestone wall. And he would listen. And he would weep, and he would say the only thing there was to say. He would say that my grandfather had been right. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, in the gathering dark of November 25th, 1941, I stayed alone at the bottom of sinkhole number 7, with my hand pressed against the cold stone with my ear against the opening I had made, and I listened to the water in the dark. And I understood at last what my grandfather had given me. He had not given me a race against August Pruitt. He had given me a door, and I had just opened it. Tobias came at first light. He came up the path slower than usual that morning, leaning harder on the walking stick than he had leaned on it the day before, and I met him at the rim of sinkhole number 7, with my hands shaking not from cold, though the cold of late November had a serious weight to it that morning, but from a thing I did not have a word for yet. He saw my face. He stopped at the rim. "Show me," he said. I led him down. He went slower than he had ever gone, and I went slower with him. And when we reached the cut at the bottom of the sinkhole, I knelt at the working face, and I gestured for him to kneel beside me, and he did with great care. And I took his old leathered hand in mine, and I put it against the cold stone beside the hole I had made, and I said, "Listen." He listened. He listened for a long time. I watched his face. The pale gray eyes did not move. The thin lips parted slightly. A small muscle moved in his jaw. When he turned his face toward mine, his eyes were full of water. "Lord Godchild, Lord God." He put his free hand on my shoulder. He gripped it hard enough that I felt the bones of his fingers through the cloth of my coat. He did not say anything else for a long time. He only knelt there beside me with his hand on my shoulder and the cold breath of the cavern moving across our faces. And after a while, I understood that he was not going to speak any words because there were no words for what he was feeling. And so I said the only thing I could think of,
which was the thing he had said to me the first day he came down into the sinkhole.
"Your back is gone, Tobias."
It is? But your arms still work.
"They do, child, they do."
Then we will widen this hole until a person can fit through it.
He nodded once. He drew himself slowly up from the kneeling position. He stood. He looked down at me, and the watery old eyes had something in them I had not seen before, something close to fierceness.
2 weeks,
he said.
We will be inside in 2 weeks.
It took us 16 days.
We worked through the first week of December in air that grew colder each morning. We chipped the opening wider, one careful chisel strike at a time. We took the limestone away in chunks the size of my fist, then the size of 2 fists, then the size of a small loaf of bread. The bedrock was generous to us in a way I have always been grateful for. It split along the natural fractures it had been waiting to split along for 10,000 years. And the wall came apart in clean pieces. And by the morning of December 11th, the opening was large enough for a thin girl to crawl through on her hands and knees. I went first.
Tobias held the lantern at the opening. I went head first, the way a child goes under a fence with my arms stretched ahead of me and my belly pressed flat against the cold stone and my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm in my throat. The passage ran downward at a slight angle for perhaps 4 feet. Then it opened. It opened into a space. I cannot tell you what it is to come out of a tight passage of stone into a space you cannot see the boundaries of. The first thing you feel is the air. It is colder than the passage, and it moves in a way that tells you the room is large. The second thing you feel is the sound. The passage had been silent. The room was not silent. The room had a soft, constant murmur in it, very close, very near the sound of a small creek moving over a stone bed in some other world.
I reached back through the opening for the lantern.
Tobias passed it through.
I held it up. The light fell on the floor of the cavern, and it did not reach the walls. I crawled forward on my hands and knees. The lantern threw my shadow huge against a curve of glistening stone 20 feet away. I stood up. The ceiling was higher than I could see clearly in the lantern light, perhaps 15 feet, perhaps 20. The room was wide. It went on into the dark. I could feel the size of it before I could see it, the way you feel the size of a church when you walk in alone at dusk. I lifted the lantern higher. The cavern was perhaps 60 feet long and 30 feet wide. The ceiling was an arch of limestone hung with the slow, drip-formed shapes that water leaves behind over centuries. The walls were curved and creamy white where the lantern light touched them, and they ran with thin sheets of moisture that gathered into beads and ran down to the floor. And along the floor of the cavern, emerging from a fissure in the far wall, flowing in a channel, it had carved for itself over a length of time I could not begin to imagine, was a stream. It was perhaps 2 feet wide and 6 inches deep. It was so clear that I could see the small white pebbles on its bed. It moved with the unhurried patience of a thing that had been moving in this same channel for 10,000 years and had no reason to ever stop. I knelt at the edge of it. I cupped my hand. I dipped it into the water. The cold of it shocked me. It was the cold of a thing that had never seen the sun of water, that had spent its life in absolute darkness in the bones of the earth. And when I lifted the cupped water to my mouth and drank, my teeth ached, and the taste was the taste of clean limestone and old patience and something I want to call the inside of the world. I drank again. I drank until my throat ached from the cold. Then I went back to the opening and called for Tobias to come. He could not crawl through the way I had. His back would not bend that way. We had to widen the passage further another 2 days of chisel work before he could get inside on a low stoop. But on the morning of December 14th, he came through and he stood beside me on the floor of the cavern with the lantern in his hand, and he turned slowly all the way around, and he said one word. Ezra. That was all he said. He just said my grandfather's name into the cold, dark air of the room. My grandfather had spent 20 years trying to find, and the cavern took the name and held it, and the stream ran on, and Tobias Mercer wept the second time in 2 weeks beside me in a place that had not heard a human voice in any time that could be measured. We did not need to drill. That was the gift my grandfather had left in the back pages of notebook number 12. The water in the cavern was under pressure from the weight of the entire mountain pressing down on the aquifer above. If we could cut a channel through the lower wall of the cavern, angled out toward the surface of the slope, the water would flow out of its own accord. No pump, no machinery. Gravity and pressure would do what they had always done. Tobias studied the lower wall for 2 days before we cut a single stroke. He read the stone. He laid his old hand flat against it. He moved along the wall slowly, listening, looking, sometimes pressing his ear to the limestone and closing his eyes. He found what he was looking for on the 3rd day. A fine fracture line running diagonally from the cavern floor toward the daylight. A line the water had been wanting to take for some long time and had been prevented from taking by perhaps 18 inches of unbroken bedrock at the outer face. Here, he said, and he laid his palm against the wall. We follow this. We do not fight the stone. We let the stone show us where to cut. We began on the morning of December 17th. We worked through Christmas. We worked through the New Year. We worked through the long January cold when the cavern stayed at its constant 54 degrees, and the world above the ridge dropped to 10 and stayed there for a week. We worked through February. We worked through the first weeks of March when the snow on Sawback Mountain
began to soften, and the days grew longer by a slow accumulation of minutes. The channel grew. 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet. Each strike of the chisel rang in the closed space of the cavern like a small bell. Each chip of limestone we lifted out felt heavier than the last. Twice during that winter, August, Pruitt came back. The first time was in early January. He rode up the path on a different horse, a heavier gray one for the snow, and he stopped at the cabin door and tipped his hat and said he hoped I was finding the winter manageable. He was sorry, he said, that the petition had been a misunderstanding. He had not meant for it to feel adversarial. He wished only my safety. He was prepared. He said to raise his offer to $400 and to allow me to remain in the cabin as a tenant for as long as I wished. I told him no. He nodded. He turned the gray horse and rode back down the path. The second time was in late February. He did not come himself. He sent the young attorney, Edmund Slater, who was looking thinner than he had looked in August, and who told me that Mr. Pruitt's offer was now $600, and that he wished it to be on record that he had been most generous in the event of any future legal proceedings. I told the young attorney to tell Mr. Pruitt that the answer was the same. The young attorney looked at me for a long moment. He glanced at the ridge behind the cabin. He glanced at the path that ran up towards sinkhole number 7, where I had not yet been that morning, because Tobias was due in an hour, and we always went up together. He looked back at me. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "if I may speak as a person rather than as counsel." "You may." "He will not stop coming. I know. He believes there is something on this ridge worth more than what he is offering you. He has believed it for a long time." "He is right." The young attorney's mouth moved into a small expression that was not quite a smile. "I thought he might be." "You will tell him no for me." "I will tell him no for you." He left. I went back into the cabin. I sat at the table for perhaps 10 minutes without moving. Then I got up and I put on my coat and I walked up the path to sinkhole number 7, where Tobias was already easing himself slowly down into the cut. And I picked up the chisel and I went back to work. The breakthrough came on the morning of March 22nd, 1942. It came at 20 minutes past 8. I know the time because Tobias had borrowed his nephew's pocket watch the day before. He had put it on the ledge of the working face along with our water jug. I had been swinging for perhaps an hour. The rhythm Tobias had taught me 8 months earlier had become a rhythm I no longer thought about: the ringing strike, the small pause, the lift, the strike again, the way a heart does its work without instruction. The chisel sank into the stone in the way it always did. I lifted the sledge. I struck again. This time the chisel did not sink into stone. This time it sank through stone into the soft thinness behind it, and the wall gave way under my hand the way thin ice gives way under a careless boot, and water came through. It did not trickle. It did not seep. It came. It came in a sudden, cold, pressing rush, a hand's breadth thick at first, then wider as the opening tore itself larger from the inside, and within 10 seconds, it was a clear, cold flow that filled the cut and ran across my boots and overflowed the lip of the working face and began to pour down the slope of the sinkhole wall. I stood up. I took 2 steps backward. The water kept coming. I do not know how long I stood there. Tobias was at the rim of the sinkhole. He was not in the cut with me that morning. His back had not let him climb down for 2 days. He had been standing watch from above, lantern in hand, ready to lower tools or take up rubble. When the water came, he must have heard it, because I remember after a while looking up and seeing him at the rim, hat off white hair, lifted by the morning wind, watching the cold, clear stream rushing past my boots. He did not say anything. I climbed up the slope of the sinkhole on shaking legs. I climbed out at the rim. I stood beside him. The water was already finding its way down the natural channels of the eastern face of the ridge, falling in small, bright lines over the gray stone, gathering in a flat place below the sinkhole that had not held water in any year living memory could speak to. I was wet to the knees. The March morning was cold enough that the water on my legs had begun to numb me. I did not feel it. I lifted my face to the sky. I found it, Grandpa. I said it out loud. I said it to the cold, thin blue of a March morning sky over the eastern face of Sawback Mountain. I found your water. Beside me, Tobias Mercer took off his hat. He held it against his chest. He did not speak. He did not need to. The water was speaking for both of us and for my grandfather, and for the 22 years he had spent walking this ridge alone, and for every Sunday afternoon Tobias had played chess with him on the cabin porch while the town below mocked them both. We stood there a long time. The water ran. The work of the next 2 years was the work of building the life the water made possible. We dug a stone-lined channel down the eastern slope to direct the flow. Tobias built a settling basin of stacked limestone where the water collected before continuing down. We laid clay pipe where we could afford clay pipe and hand-cut wooden flumes where we could not. We built a small spring house over the basin, low and cool, and the constant chill of the water inside kept butter solid and milk sweet through the worst weeks of summer. I terraced the lower slopes of the ridge. I did it with Tobias's instruction and with stones I carried by hand. 10,000 stones, perhaps 20,000, until the slopes that had been bare gray rock became a stepped descent of small flat fields, each one held in place by a wall of dry stacked limestone that Tobias taught me to build the old way without mortar, with the stones cut to settle into one another the way teeth settle into a jaw. I filled the terraces with composted leaf litter hauled from the forest floor. The soil that had been a thin crust on bedrock began slowly to become real soil. By the summer of 1943, The first small orchard was producing. By the autumn, I had a dairy goat and 3 hens. By the winter, the spring house held cheese I had made myself, and a barrel of apples in dry sand, and pickled beans in glass jars I had bought at Mr. Crawford's hardware store. Mr. Crawford did not look at me sideways anymore when I came into the store. He did not laugh. He did not smile either. He simply weighed what I bought and took my money and gave me my change. I do not think he knew what to do with me. I had become, by the middle of 1943, something the town did not have a category for, which was a girl nobody had taken in, who had not failed. Judge Hiram Bell came up to the ridge in August of 1942. He came on the 22nd, exactly 12 months from the hearing. He came alone in his own buggy, in his black judge's coat, under the August sun. He walked the property with me. He saw the spring. He saw the channel and the basin and the spring house. He saw the terraces and the small orchard. He saw the goat and the hens and the cabin with its mended roof and its split-stacked firewood. He said almost nothing for an hour. At the end of the walk, we stood at the spring house, and he removed his hat, and he looked at me for a long moment. "Miss Whitmore." "Sir." "This court finds that the respondent has demonstrated to its satisfaction that she is capable of managing the property safely and productively. The petition will not be revisited. Lot 34 is yours free and clear until your 18th birthday and beyond." He paused. "Your grandfather would be proud, child." "Thank you, Your Honor." He put his hat back on. He climbed into his buggy. He drove down the path, and I never saw him in person again, though he wrote me a letter on my 18th birthday in 1944, wishing me well, and I have that letter still. The drought began in the spring of 1944. I want to tell you what a drought does to a valley. It does not announce itself. It comes in the way a thief comes on small, soft feet, and you do not know it is in your house until the things that should be there are not. The April rains were thin that year. The May rains did not come at all. By the middle of June, the creeks of Hawksbill Valley were running at a quarter of their normal flow. By the middle of July, the smaller creeks were not running at all. The wells went next. Mrs. Lattimore's well went first on the 7th of August. She had been dipping it morning and evening for 2 weeks, going deeper each time, and on the 7th of August, her bucket came up dry at the bottom of a 50-foot shaft that had given good water for 30 years. Her husband stood beside her in the dooryard and looked at the bucket and did not say anything. The Hadleys' well went 4 days later. Mr. Crawford's town well, the one that fed the public pump on Main Street, went on the 17th. By the end of August, every shallow well in Hawksbill Valley was dry, and the deep wells were dropping, and the corn in the bottomland fields was curling brown against the stalks, and the hay that had been cut in June was the only hay there would be for the year. And the farmers stood at their fences in the long evenings and looked at the sky and looked at each other and did not know what to say.
Up on my ridge, the water ran.
It ran at the same rate it had run on the morning of March 22nd, 1942.
It did not slow. It did not warm. It did not change in any way that I could measure. The aquifer beneath the ridge was a thing fed by 20 years of accumulated rainfall stored in millions of tons of porous limestone, insulated by 40 feet of solid rock, and the surface drought meant nothing to it. The first person came on a Tuesday morning in the third week of August.
I was in the orchard. I was tying up a young apple tree that had been bent by a summer storm. I heard a footstep on the path below the cabin. I looked down. Mrs. Lattimore was coming up the path. She was carrying 2 empty buckets, one in each hand. On her hip, balanced with the easy weight of a woman who had carried a great many children there in her time, was her youngest, a boy of perhaps 2 years old. She wore a pale gray dress and a sunbonnet pulled low against the August heat. She stopped at the bottom of the orchard path, and she set down the buckets, and she did not look up at me. She did not look up at me because she could not. I knew this without thinking about it. I knew it the way I had known when August Pruitt had not laughed in the courthouse 3 years earlier. There are things a person cannot do, and it is a kindness sometimes to know what those things are and to make them unnecessary. I came down the orchard path. I walked across the small yard in front of the cabin. I came to where she stood. I stopped a few feet from her. She still did not look up. The little boy on her hip looked at me with the open curiosity of a child too young to know shame. Mrs. Lattimore. Hattie. She said my name very quietly. She had not called me Hattie when I had lived in her house. She had called me girl. I was wondering, she said, if I could fill these buckets at your spring. I would pay you for the water, whatever you would ask. I looked at her for a moment. I had thought about this moment before. I had thought about it in the months since the drought began. I had imagined the people who might come up the path. I had imagined what I might say to them. I had imagined Mrs. Lattimore in particular, because she had turned me out of her house in 1939 with a kind of tired contempt that I had not quite forgotten and was not sure I ever would. I had imagined many speeches. I gave none of them. Yes, I said, of course you can. She lifted her face, then finally, and she looked at me, and her eyes had something in them I had never seen in them before, and I do not have a good word for what it was. It was not gratitude. It was something heavier than gratitude. I think it was the thing that comes over a person's face when they are made smaller by a kindness they did not believe they would receive, and they understand for a moment that they are not who they thought they were. Hattie, come with me. I took the buckets from her. I led her up to the spring house. I filled both buckets at the basin where the water ran out cold and clear and constant. I handed them back to her. Will you take payment? No, Mrs. Lattimore. I can pay. I will not take it.
She stood for a moment with the full buckets at her feet, and the child on her hip, and the August sun on her shoulders, and her mouth worked. And finally she said the thing that perhaps she had been carrying up the path with her, that perhaps she had been carrying for longer than that. I am sorry, Hattie. I know. I am sorry for what I did, for what I said, for all of it. I know you are. You did not have to be kind to me. The water does not know what you did, Mrs. Lattimore. It just runs. I think that is the right way for it to be. She picked up her buckets. She walked down the path with her child on her hip and the cold water going with her, and I watched her go until she was out of sight around the curve of the slope, and then I turned and I went back into the orchard, and I finished tying up the apple tree. The next morning, 3 women came. The morning after that, 6. By the end of the week, there were lines. I set up a filling station at the spring house. I put out a wooden bench for the older women to rest on while they waited their turn. I let any person come at any hour and take any amount they could carry, and I did not ask a single one of them for a single cent. Tobias came up to the cabin in the second week of the lines. He sat on the porch beside me in the late afternoon. We watched a woman from a farm 5 miles away coming down the path with 2 yoke buckets full of our water, walking carefully the way you walk when what you are carrying is more precious than gold. They do not deserve it, you know, he said. Most of them. Maybe not. Crawford, the Hadleys, the Lattimores. No. You could charge. I could. Some would say it is owed to you. Some would? He looked at me sideways. The pale gray eyes were very tired that afternoon. The drought had been hard on him too, on his old body, in his old house at the edge of the valley. He came up the ridge less often now. The walk was harder on his back than it had been. Why? He said. I thought about it for a while. Because the water does not care what they did, Tobias. It just flows. And I think that is the right way to be. He nodded slowly. He did not say anything else. August Pruitt came in the second week of September. He came in a buggy this time, not on horseback, with a black-coated driver at the reins. He climbed down stiffly. He had aged in the 3 years since the courthouse. He was 60 now, gray at the temples, gone to white, and his shoulders were not as wide inside the heavy coat as they had once been. He carried a leather portfolio in one hand. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Pruitt? I see your spring is producing. It is. Half the valley is up here with buckets. More than half. He cleared his throat. He glanced at the line of women and men and children at the springhouse path. He looked back at me. I have come to make a final offer. All right. $8,000. Outright purchase of the spring rights only. You retain the cabin, the garden, the orchard, the surrounding acreage. I take only the water.
I will install proper infrastructure. I will pipe it to Hollow Creek at fair rates. I will manage what is becoming, frankly, a public crisis with a private resource. It is a great deal of money. It is more than fair. It is. You will accept. No, Mr. Pruitt. He stood very still. May I ask why? You may. I came down the porch steps. I stood in the dirt of the yard, perhaps 4 feet from him. I was 18 years old. He was 60. I was a head shorter than him and weighed perhaps 1/3 of what he weighed. None of that mattered. My grandfather refused to sell to you in 1937, I said. He refused again in 1938. He refused a 3rd time the year before he died. Do you know why he refused, Mr. Pruitt? He was a stubborn man. He was, but that is not why. He waited. He refused because he understood what was under this rock, and he understood that what was under this rock was not the kind of thing one man should own. He was a poor man with bad land. He could have been a rich man with a great resource. He chose to be a poor man with bad land for 22 years rather than sell what he had found to someone who would pipe it for fair rates and lock it up for profit. He died poor on purpose, Mr. Pruitt, because he understood something that you, with all your 6,000 acres of timber and your 3 sawmills and your 1/4 share of the bank, have never understood. I looked at him. This water is not for sale. It will not be for sale tomorrow. It will not be for sale in 10 years. It will not be for sale when I am dead. If anyone tries to make it for sale after I am dead, my children will refuse them, and their children, and their children. Do you understand what I am telling you? He looked at me for a long moment. He looked at the line of people at the spring house. He looked at the spring itself, the cold, clear water running silver over the limestone in the September sun. He nodded once. He climbed back into the buggy without another word. The driver clucked at the horse. The buggy rolled down the path. I never saw August Pruitt again. He died in 1949 of a stroke at his desk in the offices of the Pruitt Lumber Company, and his sons sold the company 3 years later, and the timber tracts went to a corporation in Pittsburgh, and the old man's name slowly fell out of conversation in Hollow Creek. The way the names of powerful men do when they have left nothing behind that anyone wishes to remember. The drought broke in October. The first rains came on a Tuesday afternoon. I stood on the porch of the cabin and watched them sweep in across the valley from the west. A dark shawl of cloud trailing rain like skirts, and the whole valley below me went silver and green again under the wet, and the line at my spring house thinned for the first time in 2 months. The wells started to recover by the end of November. Mrs. Lattimore came up one last time in early December. She brought a jar of preserves she had made from her own apples, the first her tree had given her since the drought began, and she did not look at the ground when she handed them to me. The school teacher, Cordelia Bramall, came to the ridge the next spring. She had been writing me letters since the previous winter. She was 36 years old, unmarried, the school teacher of Hollow Creek's one-room school for the past 11 years, and she had heard about the spring and the cavern and my grandfather's notebooks. She wanted to see them. She said, to help me make sure they were preserved. I let her see them. She read all 14 notebooks in 2 weeks of evenings at my kitchen table. When she was done, she closed the last one carefully, and she said, "Hattie, this is real science. This needs to go to the State Geological Survey." They will not listen to a self-taught man with bad land. They will listen to 14 notebooks of careful observations and a confirmed aquifer the size of this one. They will listen because they have to. She helped me write the letter. She helped me copy the most important pages. She mailed the package to Charlottesville on a morning in May of 1945. Dr. Alistair Thorne came in July. He was a tall, thin man in his 50s, with iron gray hair and the careful manners of a person who has spent his life in libraries. He brought 2 graduate students with him. They camped on the ridge for 3 weeks. They tested the water. They mapped the cavern. They measured the flow rate, the temperature, the mineral content, the dissolved oxygen. They walked every inch of Lot 34 with my grandfather's notebooks open in their hands. At the end of the 3 weeks, Dr. Thorne came to the cabin porch in the evening. He sat in the chair Tobias had usually sat in when Tobias still came up to the ridge. He held a glass of water from my spring house. He looked at me for a long moment. "Miss Whitmore." "Doctor, your grandfather got it right. All of it. The map, the fracture analysis, the aquifer location, the estimated volume. He missed by less than 10% on every measurement we have been able to verify working with 20-year-old data with no instruments other than a thermometer and a measuring chain. He was a careful man." "He was a scientist, Miss Whitmore. A self-taught one, working alone, ignored with no resources, and he got it right. The aquifer beneath this ridge is one of the largest undocumented freshwater reserves in the Blue Ridge province. It will be in textbooks by the end of the decade." "What will it be called?" He smiled slightly. "That will be up to the survey to decide, but I will recommend in my paper that it be called the Whitmore Aquifer, after Ezra, with your permission." "You have my permission, Doctor." He published the paper in the spring of 1946. The Whitmore Aquifer of the Blue Ridge province. My grandfather's name appeared in print for the first time in his life, and the first time after his death, with no joke attached to it. I read the paper by lamplight one evening at the kitchen table. When I was done, I walked up the ridge in the dark, and I laid the journal flat on the small stone Tobias had carved for my grandfather's grave near the cavern entrance. And I weighted it down with a piece of limestone, and I left it there overnight. In the morning, the journal was damp from dew, but the paper had not run. I took it back inside. I married Wendell Ashby in the autumn of 1947. He was a quiet school teacher from the next county, over the kind of man who listened more than he talked. The kind of man who came up the ridge one Saturday afternoon to see the famous spring and stayed for supper, and then for breakfast, and then eventually for the rest of his life.
We had 4 children on the ridge. I named the eldest girl after my mother and the eldest boy after my grandfather. Tobias died in the winter of 1949. He was 79. He died in his own house at the edge of the valley, in his own bed, of nothing more dramatic than an old body finally setting itself down. I buried him on the ridge near the cavern entrance under a stone. I carved myself with my own hands the way he had taught me to carve stone in the autumn of 1941. The stone says only Tobias Mercer and the dates of his life, and below that, the words he read the stone.
The Hollow Creek Water Cooperative was established in 1955. I served on the board, but I refused to be its chairwoman. I signed the easement that piped water from my spring to the town cistern for $1, and I asked only that the water remain free to anyone in Hawksbill Valley who needed it. The cooperative is still in operation today, run by my granddaughter and her husband. Wendell died on the porch of the cabin in 1978. He was sitting in the chair where Tobias had sat. He was watching the sun drop behind Sawback Mountain. I sat beside him and held his hand until the last warmth went out of it and the stars came up over the ridge. I buried him next to Tobias. In 1981, the state of West Virginia designated the Whitmore Aquifer as a protected natural resource. In 1983, the Geological Society of Virginia awarded my grandfather posthumously the Heartland citation for significant contributions to the understanding of karst hydrology. I accepted the award on his behalf. I wore a plain, dark dress to the ceremony. I stood at the podium in a hall full of geologists and university officials, and I said a short thing into the microphone. My grandfather did not need this award, I said. He needed one person to listen. I am glad I was that person. I died in the spring of 1985. I was 59 years old. They found me in the garden, kneeling beside the lower terrace wall, my hands in the soil. My daughter said it looked as though I had simply paused to rest and decided to stay. The spring is still flowing. It has not stopped. Not in drought, not in flood, not in the hardest winters or the hottest summers. It runs at the same patient, unhurried rate. It ran on the morning of March 22nd, 1942. And it will run that way long after this voice has gone quiet, long after the cabin has fallen, long after the names of every man and woman who laughed in that courthouse in 1941 have been forgotten by the valley they thought they owned. On the wall of the spring house carved into the limestone by Tobias Mercer's steady hand in the summer of 1943, there is a single line. It says, "What they call worthless, they simply have not looked beneath." So I want to ask you something. What have they told you is worthless about you? What 30 acres of rock are you sitting on? What inheritance of struggle? What legacy of things that look like nothing that you have not yet dug into? What is flowing beneath the surface of your life that you have not found because everyone around you told you there was nothing there? The people who laugh are always the people who have not dug. They see the surface, the rock, the poverty, The borrowed dress. The orphan standing alone at the back of the courtroom. They think they are seeing everything. They are not. They never are.
The surface is the least interesting part of any piece of land and of any human being. Dig deeper. The water is there. It has always been there. It has been waiting for someone stubborn enough, patient enough, and brave enough to ignore the laughter and start moving rocks. Your 30 acres of rock are not a joke. They are a beginning. Start digging.